Great stuff. All righty. Everybody's joining. Let's just give everyone a few minutes to get onto the call. Great. Amazing. Thanks, Tim.
Pleasure.
Amazing. Good stuff. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, everybody, to our red and yellow webinar. This is the fifth one already this year. And it's been an amazing journey to not only host these webinars, but certainly to also provide these sessions that are a bit of lunchtime learning. So an opportunity to really lean into a wonderful expert to find out more information about this incredible discipline that we all love so much, and to also spend it not only gaining some additional and valuable insights, but to also connect with an important person in our industry and also find out and ask those burning questions that we have. I'm Elizabeth Lee Ming. I head up marketing here at Red and Yellow, and I'm delighted to host today's webinar, but to also welcome our guest speaker today, Tim Withers. So just some quick housekeeping while we wait for everybody to jump on the call and to join the webinar. The webinar will consist of Tim really sharing some incredible wisdom on the call today. And if you do want to ask any questions, please feel free to do so. There is going to be an opportunity for myself to pose these questions to Tim throughout the session. So please feel free at any point in time to pop your questions into the chat, and these questions will be raised with Tim. Secondly, there is an incredible prize up for grabs from Tim. We're very, very excited. So a big, big thank you to Tim. He is offering a 1-hour extremely valuable business consultation with you to look at your own growth marketing opportunities within your business. 1-hour free consultation will go to one very, very lucky winner who is on this webinar. So please stay on right until the end. We have a fun little activation. Team have worked hard to put a real simulation together that will randomly select someone from the audience to join us and who will be able to ultimately receive this incredible prize. So today's webinar is called 3 Growth Marketing Mistakes Most Businesses Make and How to Avoid Them. As a business and certainly as a marketer who's worked across a number of organizations, both on agency and client side, it certainly has been something that we all understand and we can all relate to. It is something that none of us as businesses can get away from. We're all looking at ways to accelerate our businesses, to do more with less, to improve the performance of the work we do. And this is why we thought that today's webinar and today's topic would be extremely, extremely relevant and valuable to all of you. And we couldn't ask for a better presenter to join us and to host this webinar with us and to present and to share. Hi, Grant from London, how wonderful. So we have guests from not only all 4 corners of South Africa, but certainly from around the world as well, who have tuned in to listen to the wisdom that Tim has to share. So a quick intro about Tim. So Tim Withers is the founder and chief growth officer of ATIM Consulting. He also consults to Red and Yellow. We're very grateful for that. Tim has worked at a number of amazing institutions ahead of starting ATIP. He's worked at Quirk, he's worked at Saatchi & Saatchi, he's worked at 2U and also at Jeff. He is probably one of the most prolific performance marketers I've certainly worked with, and gets as excited about data as I do, which is always fun. Is extremely efficient at highlighting some of our own blind spots and pointing out some of those key mistakes that we either are making or preventing us from making them. And that really helps to fast track not only our own learning, but certainly our own performance as well. He is a lover of dogs, so that's the other thing Tim and I have in common, which we love. And I think both of us are a pushover for a rescue and are very, very dangerous if we see any puppies around us. We pretty much are looking for a lot of problems at our own home if there are too many puppies that need rescuing around us. So I'm delighted to have Tim join us today. I'm absolutely delighted to see so many of you on this call today. And without much further ado, I'm very, very pleased to hand over to Tim.
Thank you, Liz. That was a lovely intro. I really do appreciate it, and I hope I live up to the billing. I've actually kicked 4 of my dogs outside right now, so I have 2 in my office. I have this sort of MO now where I know that 4 of them need to stay outside in the garden and 2 of them can stay in the office, and they're generally okay. So hopefully, knock on wood, they don't disrupt us too much, if at all. But yeah, it's great to be here with you all. I'm really excited for this, and I hope that you will get value from it. First of all, we wanted to start with just a bit of a poll to ask, how well do you understand growth strategy? So how well do you believe you understand growth strategy ahead of this session? Almost there. We've got 76 answers now. But a pretty good spread. There's a bit of data for us. Very, very interesting. And I wonder if this will have changed at all at the end of the session. Hopefully a little bit, if, at the very least. Yeah, very, very interesting. So I'm gonna move forward, and yeah, I really, really appreciate your participation in giving us some insight into our audience today. So those are our results. Okay. Thank you so much. To move forward, so today I'm going to be discussing 3 mistakes I often see in growth strategy. 3 mistakes that many businesses make, that I myself have made. I'm most certainly not a stranger to mistakes. Let's put it that way. There are more, but I'm going to sort of tap into 3 in particular. And I'm just going to get right into it because I want to give us as much time as possible for Q&A at the end, and yeah, let's get as much value from the session as we possibly can. So firstly, mistake number 1 is looking at the wrong KPIs and very often not even capturing the right data. So what do I mean by this? And to give you an example, there are businesses I've worked with and scenarios I've worked in where a team is only looking at traffic to a site, for example. They're looking at sessions driven. It's literally that high level and that linear. And that's what the team's motivated by. That's what they're measured on. And that sounds quite surprising, I believe, because that is a very linear measure of performance. And you wouldn't really expect that, but I've seen that in some businesses that are otherwise quite sophisticated. So if you're only looking at something that linear and that sort of surface level, it's going to become problematic because you can't measure the performance of a business accurately on that, right? But even in businesses that have more sophisticated measures and they're looking at performance in a more sophisticated way, which is, the case in many, very few businesses actually have what I would consider a sort of robust framework and a really good understanding of their business drivers end to end. So you might find that you have businesses who are they have a form of annuity revenue. They have customers that they can sort of deliver lifetime value, but they're not looking at that effectively, if at all. They're looking at how much it costs them to acquire someone in the first place. And naturally, if you're in a business that has, a subscription model or repeat purchases where you have the potential for lifetime value, if you're not effectively measuring that and you're looking at that initial indicator of, we paid this much to get this person in, or this was the marketing that brought this person in, that's a very incomplete picture. And the reason a lot of businesses end up in that position is because it's difficult to get that more comprehensive view of your customers, who they are, where they came from, what their value is over time. So a mistake that I often look to correct is to assess what data is being captured, what KPIs the team is operating against, what they're measured against, what the business's understanding is of its performance drivers, from, in most respects, lead generation all the way to sales. And then in some cases, as I said, beyond that, if they have repeat customers or they've got some kind of subscription model and they expect it to be lifetime value. And then within that, drilling down to each of those junctures. So looking at when a business is generating leads, what questions are they asking of those leads? What understanding do they have of who those leads are? What understanding do they have of where those leads came from different channels? As those leads move through their funnel, as those leads move through the path to conversion, do they have an understanding of the different pieces of communication that drive that behavior or not? Very often the case is no. Very often the case is they don't, or they will have an understanding of who the person is initially, and that kind of gets lost as they move through their journey with you. And what you ideally want is you want that view of when this person, for example, first came to us, they came to us via an Instagram post. We know that. We then have an understanding that they created a profile. So that was their first interaction. They saw an Instagram post that drove the initial interest. They then created a profile, for example, on our site or our app. They then received an email. They didn't do anything with that email. They received a couple more emails. Eventually, they were interested. They clicked on that email. They came through. They performed another action, and so on and so forth, all the way to ideally transacting, and then, if it's applicable, repeating the transactions. That's what you really want. Now, it's a very difficult place to get to in many respects because it requires alignment across marketing, tech. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of consideration. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but that's a great place to be. Failing being there, at the very least, you need to be looking at the metrics that are likely to contribute to business value and ensuring that any metrics you are looking at and measuring your business on aren't metrics that are going to create misdirection. An example of that would be, as I said, someone or a team being assessed on how many eyeballs they drive to a website. That might be somewhat relevant very early in a business's growth. If you're launching a new product in a new market and you literally just want to blast awareness, that's not an irrelevant thing to look at. But you need to be as best as possible assessing then who those people are. Okay, you're getting lots of eyeballs on your site. You're getting lots of visibility, awareness, exposure. But how good an understanding can you actually have of the mix within that? Even if it is just saying, we understand which channels are driving that. We can say that 40% of our traffic's coming from social media, 20% is coming from direct, this percentage is coming from organic, et cetera, because they also all will behave differently. So very often I find businesses are either looking at the wrong KPIs entirely, they don't even know what KPIs to look at in some respects, or they're looking at the wrong data within their KPIs. They're actually not capturing the right data. And I don't believe I've given you an example of that. So just very quickly, it would be along the lines of, let's say you're advertising an education product and you don't ask any information at the lead capture stage. So someone comes in and you want them to express interest in your product. You want them to download an info pack. You just ask them first name, last name, email, and phone number. You don't ask them anything about who they are, and you don't enrich that data. That's obviously an incomplete picture. You don't understand who your leads are. And it's even worse when you don't actually understand where they came from, which is also sometimes a problem that businesses have. So they'll get leads in, they don't understand which channel they came from, they don't understand who they are in terms of the individual characteristics of that person. And then they might look at their leads and say, well, we're doing so well, we've got so many leads, but the reality is that 95% of those leads aren't even relevant, and you don't know that. So it's a big problem I often encounter, and it actually surprises me how often it comes up. So problem number 2 is not experimenting enough. And within this, not being comfortable with failure, and I put that in air quotes, and I'll tell you why, and very often not learning effectively from tests. So the reason I put that in air quotes is because I believe failure is a fantastic thing. I think failure is a fantastic thing, and I kind of have to believe this because I failed a lot. But I believe failure is a gift in many respects. If I hadn't failed as often as I have, I wouldn't have learned nearly as much as I have. And I think in this space, like, you need to learn to be comfortable with failure. You need to create a culture that's comfortable with failure. And so your team needs to be comfortable with failure. And if you're not comfortable with failure and your team's not comfortable with failure, you don't learn as rapidly as you could. And that leads to an aversion to experimentation. So you need to test, you need to experiment a lot. You need to do this because things are constantly changing and evolving at an almost unprecedented rate. It's not slowing down, it's increasing, if anything. And also you need to do this because many times things don't behave the way you expect them to. I have myself so many times expected something to work out a certain way, and it's turned out to be the complete opposite, and I've looked like a fool. And then I've learned from it, and I've made sure that I've sort of committed that to memory, and I'm not going to make that same mistake again. So you need to be experimenting a lot. You need to be doing so within a robust framework so you can, learn very effectively from it, because often tests are also done, experiments are done, and they're not learned from. And in some respects, and I've made this mistake myself, the person who ran that test in the first place might even forget the results, and they might end up doing the same thing again. Never mind the teams who are going to be, in future running marketing for a business, for example. Never mind them, where if they don't have access to that knowledge, if that knowledge hasn't been democratized and institutionalized, what hope do they have? They're going to come in and they're going to retread the same steps, make the same mistakes. So having a robust framework where you're very clear on your testing MO, testing principles, your do's and don'ts, how you measure that, where you document those learnings, how you democratize that. So, it can just be a simple Google spreadsheet, for example, as long as it's consistently tracked and measured, and you have a means of also creating some kind of roadmap, ideally, where you can prioritize your tests, you can prioritize your experiments, you can assess them fairly against each other. So it needs to be impartial in terms of how you're assessing them to determine what you're doing and when. But I generally don't see enough experimentation done. And it's just a massive component of being successful in the space. Then over-engineering. So within this, very often scrapping this work shortly thereafter. I have done this so many times, especially when I started. I thought I was so clever on many an occasion, creating this like complex campaign with all these moving parts and all this messaging and all these layers. And I was so excited. And then it bombed completely, just fell flat on its face. And that's because so much of what we do is unpredictable. And we have an understanding of behavior, and we have an understanding of what does and doesn't work, but there's so many layers to it, there's so many nuances to it. Also, sometimes over-engineering just gets too granular. So in the context of digital media, you obviously want to get quite specific about your messaging and your audience. You want to get as targeted as possible. But if you become too targeted, if it becomes too contrived and too over-engineered, often that results in suboptimal results. You can get too tight, you can restrict the ad platforms, they don't serve your ads properly, they don't get enough data, they don't learn effectively, or you actually exclude audiences who are relevant. So, for example, when looking at age ranges and targeting, sometimes it's better to leave it more open-ended, because you make assumptions when you're working in the likes of Meta and Google about ages of people, and often I find it's tricky to make that call, because if you're looking at, say, 18 to 65 plus being your available ages, where do you cut that off? You might think, well, hang on, it's likely the people who are interested in my product are going to be 30 plus, but what if someone's 29? What if they're interested? So you can often get too specific about these things, too precise. You can over engineer it. I actually had an example last week where I was super excited about some data I pulled. I thought it was really conclusive. I put it in motion and it just didn't work the way I expected. In fact, performance declined as a result, even though the data looked really significant. And I was convinced that this was going to be the right call. So that's something I've learned. You know, I've now committed that to memory. I'll move forward and I'll bear that in mind in future. But I find over engineering is also problematic in that you need to move very rapidly in the space, largely because everyone else is. And you know, that's how you learn and you sort of improve over time. If you're over engineering, you're also not moving quickly. You're not moving quickly. Someone else is gonna steal your lunch. Someone else is gonna move faster than you because they just got, you know, they got their product out there, they got their marketing out there, and they've already started learning and experimenting, iterating when you haven't even got something off the ground. And I've got some bonus mistakes. So I decided to introduce these because, as I said, there are lots of mistakes I can talk to, and why not? So the first one is what I like to call the growth echo chamber. And this results in misalignment, missed opportunities, reduced trust. It's just generally not a good time. So the growth echo chamber exists for a number of reasons. One is because, in my experience, there's quite often an aversion to sharing information more broadly in an organization by growth and marketing functions. Like, there's a little bit of an aversion sometimes because marketing faces a lot of scrutiny. Everyone thinks they can do marketing to a degree. And to be honest, like, most people can do marketing to a degree. But there's a big difference between, you know, being able to run a campaign and being able to do it effectively, and being able to, you know, do data analysis and being able to do it effectively. But the reality is that everyone kind of has these things at their fingertips. Everyone can go and create an account in Meta, an account in Google. They've probably played around in analytics. They've probably done a course. You know, they probably think they understand the sort of ins and outs of it all. And within reason, they're right. So most people can ask questions, and that creates a bit of a distraction for those functions. It's not nice to be, you know, under scrutiny in the way that marketing functions sometimes are, and that creates a bit of an aversion towards sharing, and it creates this kind of echo chamber effect where you're not getting the insight or perspective from those functions that you could. You're not getting insight or perspective from your broader organization, and generally that's detrimental. Any sort of benefit you get from not sharing information, from not democratizing information or data, I believe is more than offset by the downsides of that. I've so often got massive value from very smart stakeholders in the business, working in other functions, in finance, in tech, in design, in HR, even just broadly. You know, there are lots of smart people, lots of very smart people who are passionate about what they do, passionate about the business they work in, and they're able to challenge your thinking. And I believe the task here for marketing and growth functions is to ensure that those people are equipped with the best possible knowledge, that they have trust in what you're doing, which comes about through sharing. So you build and foster trust. You have clear alignment. That's going to, more often than not, result in them asking good questions, in them actually being a great thinking partner, and not being a distraction, and not being a negative factor that can sometimes be the perception. So something that I work very hard on is creating that alignment, trying to benefit from other people's perspectives and views, and really engendering that trust. So it's a huge thing. It's a big undertaking, but it's so worthwhile when you get it right. And conversely, when you don't, as I said, it can be seriously detrimental, especially when you're not delivering results, especially when things aren't going well. If others don't have sight of it, they don't understand what's happening, especially if they don't understand the challenges that you face, it's not a good time. And then bonus mistake number 2. So being unfamiliar with digital legislation. So I think this is a pretty interesting one. What this results in is draconian restrictions, or even worse, legal hot water. Now, those draconian restrictions can actually be imposed by the marketing or growth team themselves, because they don't understand the legislation they're working within. They don't understand the constraints they're working within. So they err on the side of caution, and they often restrict themselves. There are other instances, of course, where there's a lack of understanding and businesses make bad mistakes, and they can potentially land up in legal hot water, or at the very least with very unhappy, dissatisfied customers. And this is something I've had to navigate quite a few times. Especially when a new law comes into play, when something comes into play regarding compliance or user privacy and security, it's difficult to discern the sort of ins and outs of that regulation initially, and sometimes they sort of shift and evolve over time. To give you an example, GDPR, when GDPR first came to the forefront several years ago, everyone was incredibly anxious about it. It had been a long time coming, but it still almost kind of crept up on us because, it was a sort of looming presence. And I think everyone sort of just was so busy doing whatever else they had to do that they kind of lost sight of the fact that it was creeping up on them. And then suddenly it was in play and everyone was scrambling to, put the necessary changes in place. And I know that in the immediate aftermath of GDPR's coming into practice, there were lots of challenging constraints to work within, and there were lots of very challenging conversations with legal teams and, trying to figure out what you could and couldn't do, how much wiggle room you had, and so on and so forth. And fortunately, we had taken a lot of time to read up on it beforehand. So we had good questions. And, when we were in a discussion where something was being suggested or we were being told that we would need to make a change that would have been quite damaged to us, we were in a position to sort of question that and provide a perspective from the marketing side and have a good conversation, and try and find if there was a resolution, if there was some way to perhaps, be compliant, to tick the boxes, but without, doing unnecessary damage to ourselves. There are also instances where this kind of thing is concerned, where there's a little bit of a grace period. There's a grace window, but if you're not familiar with it, at least to a degree, you can't really take advantage of that. If you are familiar, you can kind of buy yourself some time. And we had loads of time for Poppy, of course. But even then, there was a grace window. And, you can buy yourself some time if you are sufficiently equipped in those conversations with other stakeholders in your business, never mind anyone external to your business. And you can prevent things being put into place that have an adverse effect on your business and its performance. So I believe this is something that we all need to keep an eye on. We all need to have conversations about. We need to have good discussions with legal teams and other teams where this is concerned, because they're great allies. If they trust and believe in what you're doing, and they think that you're ultimately looking to operate ethically, and that you just want to find the sort of path of least resistance, or the way forward that will allow them to do what they need and allow them to sleep easy, both about the legal requirements of the business, but also about the revenue performance of the business. That's a great place to be in. But you have to have those clear lines of communication. You have to be relatively well informed yourself. If not, the downsides are quite obvious. So I've got another poll before we get into Q&A. And this is, have you experienced any of these mistakes? So I'm very interested to hear what the answers to this might be. Okay. Cool. Let's end it there. We're on 75% participation, which I think is pretty solid. Share the results. So there we go. So majority of you have experienced some of these mistakes. That's excellent. I'm glad that I wasn't just talking about stuff that no one's familiar with at all. Go. Okay, questions and answers.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Tim. So before we get into question and answers, thanks so much for sharing what turned out to be top 5 mistakes. I know that there are probably a dozen more that we've certainly experienced. One of the points I wanted to raise is, as marketers, we always fight very hard. Not only we have fought very hard as well for a seat on the C-suite and at the table, and more importantly, to be recognized for significant business value that we do ultimately deliver. And I love this term, growth marketing. I think historically we always referred to ourselves as customer marketers as well. It was very data-driven, it was behavioral based. So I love that we are now referred to as growth marketers and using data. And one of the very interesting insights that came out of the recent IMC conference was where a CMO and CEO of a well-known telco were in conversation, and the CMO said, what is the difference between a marketer and an actuary? And you can replace actuary with any role in the organization: sales, operations, finance, whatever title that you have. And the difference is that a marketer never pretends to be an actuary. And I love that, because the point of that analogy is that as marketers, the more we bring data to the table, the more we drive our efforts by leveraging insights and performance, the better we can secure not only our seat at the table, but also the voice to be heard. And interestingly, seeing how many, of the participants on today's call that actually raised that they've experienced a lot of these mistakes is clearly testament to that. So this is a great learning opportunity for all of us. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. I also noticed that we have 2 of our participants with their hands up, Setukile and Kerry. So I'll come back to you guys, and then you can always ask your question in person. But if I go straight into the Q&A. So the first one that came up, which I love, is definitely about how do we get this right? That's the big burning question on everybody's mind on this call. Absolutely. It's one thing to know what the mistakes are and to be able to recognize that we're doing it within our own companies or within our own departments, but ultimately, how do we fix this? So the first question, Tim, is when it comes to looking at the right metrics, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. Each user's journey is slightly unique and can take you on a different tangent. What is your advice for having a good bird's eye view of metrics versus understanding unique or customer persona specific experiences that can be improved?
That's a very good question. So the way I like to look at this is, I think it goes in phases. So early stage, when you don't have a lot of data, for example, like you're most likely going to be looking at the sort of overarching metrics, whether it's user recordings, heat or scroll mapping, analytics, whatever it is. Like you're going to look at things sort of system wide. And then you should start to identify specific audiences or personas or groups and trends based on that you can then start to break out into buckets or segments. But they should be sufficiently large for you to do that. So you need to obviously make a call on at what point do you start digging more into the specifics of behavior. What point does it make sense for your business? At what point do you think it's statistically significant? And then start drilling down when you believe you've got enough data to make that relevant, or you think that if we can make an improvement to this area, or what we believe to be this persona and their interactions with our product or our site, it'll have a marked impact on performance. Until such a point that you think it's worth drilling down, it's probably not something you waste your time on. So in the past, for example, I've run marketing in Singapore, for instance, and we got to a point where we, first of all, didn't expect that we would get anywhere near the traction that we achieved in Singapore. Like, we didn't expect that. Got huge traction in Singapore. It actually started to become, in many respects, a more valuable and viable market for us than what we believed were initially our sort of primary target markets. And we got to a point where we decided, okay, we've actually got enough data here, we've got enough interest here. this is making enough of a contribution, and we can see enough avenues for improving performance, that we're going to double down on this. Like, we're going to start tailoring our user journey to Singaporeans. We're actually going to start tailoring the messaging. We're going to start breaking out, initially when we started, we kind of had this, grouped campaign. As you do often, you're just sort of testing, different countries together. You want to see which ones get traction. We then broke those out into separate campaigns fairly quickly, but they were still going to like a generic landing page. They still had a generic sort of path to purchase. They were receiving generic comms. And then when we realized that, that was accounting for, say, 30 or 40% of our interest, at that juncture, we decided, no, let's double down on this. Like, this is pretty massive. And it's one of the, it's probably the audience that has the best balance of size, but also the greatest benefit, we believe, in sort of tailored messaging, because our messaging to that point was more sort of like US and UK centric. So we thought, okay, we don't actually have messaging that really resonates with this audience necessarily. If we go and fine tune our messaging to the US or the UK, we're probably not going to get that much benefit. Conversely, if we go and do it for the Singaporean audience, we believe there's quite a lot of improvement we can make here. We could get, case studies, testimonials, visuals, personas, all of those things that we don't believe we've really addressed adequately here, but we've been surprised by performance. Let's do that. Let's make that an initiative. So, and that's quite a roundabout way to answer your question, but I think that's just the best example that comes to mind in terms of looking at the overarching data, determining that there's actually a really big strategic opportunity here if we get involved in this and we double down on it for whatever reasons we think that this is the area where we can probably have the most impact, or the persona with which we can get the biggest performance gains, and making the call based on that. But until such a point that you have that clarity, I think don't get distracted, because you can probably still make a lot of improvements at a macro level that'll be beneficial.
Amazing. Thanks, Tim. And it looks like that answer really helped and definitely covered off on what was troubling. So another question here from Gareth. Gareth knows you, Gareth Davids.
Gareth. Gareth is a gem. Hello, sir.
So his question is, something that I've noticed from previous experiences that are familiar is, what importance do you place on data transparency and sharing of understanding within the teams that make use of the relevant data? Whether it's for a huge organization or a small business trying to get off the ground running, and the owner doesn't necessarily have the time to understand the data that their business is generating.
Great question, Gareth. So yeah, I mean, I place a lot of sort of importance and emphasis on this. I think it's massive. I think that, as I said, it fosters trust. I think without this kind of transparency, you always end up with a bit of a trust deficit in some respects. It might be one person in your organization, one stakeholder who, just doesn't feel comfortable, but often it's broader than that. Sharing the data, yes, it can pose questions that you might not necessarily want to answer, which is also why, you can try and sort of control that as best as possible. And I think that proactively sharing gives you a better opportunity to do so, whether it's dashboarding, reports, like just Loom videos, whatever it is, just any kind of dialogue that you can create around the data allows you to sort of preempt a lot of questions you would get. Otherwise, it also allows you to kind of control the flow of communication a little bit. And it means that you're less likely to be asked the questions that you don't really want to be asked. Not necessarily because you're trying to conceal anything, or because there's any anything going on that you aren't happy to talk about, but it's just an investment of time, right? Like, you don't necessarily want to be asked certain questions at certain junctures because you don't want to spend the time and energy explaining those things. And you can really effectively control that flow of communication, I find, by having those reports in place, by having dashboarding in place, by giving more people access to data, and ensuring that they're comfortable with it and they understand as well. So, if you share a dashboard with them, you can then walk them through that dashboard, what that dashboard specifically covers, what they're looking at, why it's important to them. If you don't do that, let's assume they don't have any access to data at all. They've got blind spots, and naturally they're going to be uncomfortable, especially if they're in like finance, or you're talking about the CEO or another key business stakeholder. That's if they don't have data. If they have access to data, but they're just kind of left to their own devices, they might go in there and look at something and misinterpret it, misread it, misunderstand it, and that might open a whole can of worms that you have to deal with. They might even start looking at the wrong metrics, which comes down to the wrong KPIs piece again, where you can then sort of get pulled in the wrong direction, because even though you're quite sort of steadfast on the KPIs you believe you should be tracking and working towards, someone else comes along and now they've got an idea that this is actually more important than what you say is of importance. And you either need to then convince them otherwise, or run the risk of actually sort of being caught up in that sort of tide of pressure to kind of conform to what they want you to be doing.
The point that you make around dashboarding, Tim, certainly in our environment and in a number of environments, that is the best way to consolidate and represent data in a way that makes sense. And sometimes people still tend to be quite afraid of data, particularly in the C-suite as well, interestingly enough, but also because it's something that people don't necessarily understand. So your best, I really vigorously agree with you that opportunity to create a C-suite dashboard or to create a lens on the data that really crunches through and helps to visualize what those key business indicators are and what ultimately it means for the business. That really is a great tip in terms of fast tracking and demonstrating and leading with growth marketing. One always thinks that growth marketing is an opportunity to not only experiment and test, but it is a way to really short circuit that learning within the organization. And your biggest opportunity to scale and then ultimately drive growth is being able to short circuit. Absolutely. So that leads me to two very interesting questions that are asked. And the first one is, well, if this is the case, that now growth marketing is something that is ultimately the way that we do marketing, or certainly performance marketing, then what came before and after not experimenting enough?
What does that mean exactly?
I know. So I guess one could think of it in terms of, maybe the person who asked the question can lean in here a little bit as well. You can just raise your hand, but I do think that it's about, if the way that we run our businesses now from a growth marketing perspective is about driving experimentation, how do you know that, number one, you may not be experimenting enough, maybe is one way to look at it, but also that if you want to, maybe another way to look at it is what would be the best path to doing experimentation, because it actually ties into the next question, which is what tips could you give to a new business in tech? So if you took that lens around experimentation, what would almost your advice be for a 3-step plan on what you would want to implement from a growth marketing perspective? And let's use the business in tech example because somebody specifically asked that.
All right. Okay. Awesome. So I think on the experimentation piece, just to touch on that regarding, not experimenting enough or experimenting too much. I feel that if you're not, like, the way to assess if you're not experimenting enough is, often just sit down for 10 minutes or 20 minutes and jot down some ideas of things you think you could be testing, and sort of do a stock check of how much of these are we actually doing. Even better to spend a bit more time on it than that, and build up a list, maybe a spreadsheet where you start to prioritize the things. Look through your ecosystem. If you've got an app, look at your app, look at your site. If you've got any sort of customer feedback, any consumer insights, look through those. Like, are there questions that come out? Are there things that you really feel you would benefit from having the answers to? Are you looking to get those answers? Yes or no? If no, then you should be testing those things. In terms of experimenting too much, I think that comes down a lot of the time to prioritization. So it comes down to having that list, having some kind of framework or some kind of means to assess what you should or shouldn't be testing, or what is or isn't most important to you right now. One of the lenses I like to apply there is risk. So, is there a revenue risk to not doing this? Like for example, do you believe that if you don't address this particular piece, you're not going to be able to grow at the rate that you aspire to? Or even worse, is there some kind of legislative risk? Is there a competitor risk? Is there another market risk to not doing something, to not improving, to not understanding something? That would then be a very strong motivator to put that to the front of the queue. If that's not the case, then you can look at it purely from a lens of how much revenue you might lose or gain by improving in a specific area. And often you end up having in that framework various tests or experiments that are kind of contingent on each other. So, you'll have this natural flow of, we actually need to address this first before we do this thing. And that makes things quite nice and easy. So having that list, sort of starting to prioritize that list, understanding if you have burning questions you're not attempting to answer. And then I think it comes down as well, just like your own bandwidth, the size of your team and that type of thing. Like, you don't want your team to be distracted. If you feel like putting another test into the mix, it's going to mean that they can't pay adequate attention to the other things that are important, then don't do it. But even more so, obviously don't introduce another experiment if it's introducing more variables into play, because you can't test more variables. Your test needs to be isolated. You need to ring fence it. You need to ensure that you're not muddying your own data. So for example, very simple example here. If you wanted to test messaging in an ad, don't go and change the visual and the headline at the same time. Like, change one or the other. That's a very simple, very dumbed down example, but you'd be surprised how often that kind of thing happens, that multiple sort of variables are tested concurrently, and then you don't have any kind of conclusive answer. In terms of tips for a new business, so I think firstly, trying to get that understanding of your KPIs, of your drivers, as best as possible. So like, what are those in the space? What do you believe they will be? Then looking at your, I think a very important consideration very early on is what kind of CRM are you going to use? It's a huge consideration. It's one that has a lot of ramifications once you've gone a little bit down that road. If you make the wrong choice, and the wrong choice doesn't necessarily mean a bad product. It can mean a very good product that just isn't a good fit for your business. And I have lots of discussions and debates about this, and there are lots of points of view. But choosing the right system for your business is critical, because a CRM such as HubSpot or Salesforce or Zoho, not only is that a customer relationship management tool, it's also a data layer. So you can get a very good data architecture early on if you choose the right tool. Conversely, if you choose the wrong tool, you're going to have most likely quite a lot of challenges in the immediate, or even immediate future, even beyond that, depending on whether you change or how quickly you can resolve that. So I think that's very important. And then I think having that list, actually, just of like things that you want to test and improve beyond like MVP, is and actually a way to think about this is, if it's a new business, let's say you haven't launched a site at this point, launch your site, like brainstorm your kind of bare bones functionality, the things that you think are non-negotiables, like I have to have these things, but always assess that against sort of speed to launch. So, if something's going to slow you down markedly, rather don't do it now unless it's absolutely critical that you have it in place. Take your site live, start accumulating data, have a very clear view of the functionality that you parked for that initial build. And that should then feed into what you want to test, because now you have an opportunity to actually test that functionality and to continue building as you go. And I generally feel that where that type of thing is concerned, where product launches are concerned, where site launches are concerned, where app launches are concerned, more often than not, it's the business that moves fast and releases a minimum viable product, but adequately addressing their risk. But it's generally that business who gets it out there and then has a robust framework for testing, experimentation, iteration, that does better than the business who spends significantly longer period of time poring over it, being overly methodical, and as sort of over engineering it.
Amazing. Thanks, Tim. That was really, really helpful. Just a reminder to everyone, we will do the draw very shortly. There's actually just 2 more questions. And I think that one that was specifically asked by Kath has already been answered, particularly with regards to experimentation. And absolutely, I can definitely vouch for that as well. I think one of the key opportunities is just this, and really understanding that there is a level of robust experimentation that needs to be done, but that importance around isolating, what is the variable, and not trying to test for too many things at once is key, because you do want to be able to understand what is that lever that I pulled that ultimately made the difference. So some
It's
really
amazing
good
to
advice
Kath,
there.
by the
Thank
way.
you. Thank you,
Sorry to jump in. I was just say hello, Kath. It's so lovely to see you.
Tim. Great. Okay, so last two questions, and then guys, we're going to do the draw. Just a reminder, the prize is 1 hour in consultation with Tim. You'll be able to raise all of your questions, as many questions as you need to in that hour with Tim, or just have him evaluate your own business and some of your key business challenges and help you plot a path for success in growth marketing that you might need. Okay, yes, very, very exciting. Okay, last two questions. So I love this one. And I love the last one even more because I think it'll really leave everybody that's on this call a great idea in terms of something they can apply within their own business. Okay, so second last question. What KPIs should be used in marketing a business, and which of these ideally they would be easy to track? So in your mind, starting off, what KPIs, like what are those key performance indicators that are really going to move the needle, and how would you be able to track them?
Good question. So I think let's just assume you have Google Analytics installed, because that's obviously free and everyone should be running Google Analytics. So if you have Google Analytics, I know I said, don't look at sessions, for example, but you're going to have to look at your session count. Just don't put too much weight in it. Don't fixate on it. Now, let's assume for this example, you don't have like sophisticated forms. You're not capturing any kind of like demographic information or anything along those lines. Just within Google Analytics, you'll be able to get a view of obviously your session count, your bounce rates, your time on site, your pages per session, and break that down by channel. And that's already a very good view of the sort of overall health of your site, of your business, especially if you're coming at this from a perspective of not having had that view previously. If I look back to when I first started practicing this kind of thing, which was like the early 2000s, that was a dream. Like, we didn't have anything like that. The analytics packages were so rudimentary. They were awful. So just to have that view now of, that you're getting this many eyeballs on your content. This is how long they're spending engaging with your content on average, so many pages they're viewing. These are the pages that they're exiting from, so those could be potentially problematic. What is your exit rate on your worst performing pages in relation to your best performing pages? You'll be able to see which channels they came from, as I said. So you'll be able to see, did they come from organic search? So are these people actually discovering your site just through Google search without any paid media? Are they coming via direct? So are they actually aware of your brand? What percentage of your overall traffic is constituted of those people? And how are they engaging with you? And then finally, where they're coming from geographically, whether that's broader, international audience, or most likely if it's a small business just finding its feet, regionally, where are they coming from? And how does that sort of align to your expectations of who you believe your audience to be, or the audiences you ideally want to target? Is there a misalignment there? Is that actually quite well aligned? And you can apply similar principles to things like Instagram. You get some really good basic analytics on Instagram, for example, at a profile level. You can get some good demographic insights into terms of like age splits, how people are engaging with your profile, which posts are most relevant to them, which ones are resonating the most with them. So I think you can get a lot of insight just in those terms. And then you can obviously get more sophisticated in terms of saying, we've got forms on our site. Are we actually asking the relevant questions here? Let's test. Let's introduce one question and see what happens. And then you can go back to analytics and say, okay, we introduced that one question, and our conversion rate from people coming to our site and submitting an inquiry hasn't dropped. So now we have the benefit of the answer to the question without a decline in performance. Is there another question that we'd really benefit from knowing the answer to? If yes, let's add that in. Let's see if the conversion rate drops. If not, fantastic. To the point where, you believe that you're getting enough answers and you feel like introducing more questions is not really going to, the benefit of additional clarity is not really going to it's not going to outweigh this kind of detriment to performance. But that would be what I would generally look at initially.
Amazing. Great. Tim, those are really comprehensive answers. There's one last question for you to wrap up the webinar. and for us to do the amazing draw. So finishing strong, what tips could you provide to a new business in terms of marketing and having a user-friendly way to view their data?
Nice question. So I think in terms of having a user-friendly way to view their data, as I said, analytics it's a good package, especially where you're sort of like site metrics concerned, where your engagement metrics concerned in terms of understanding your content and what's resonating and not. Otherwise, HubSpot's a great tool. HubSpot's a really good CRM. It's one that actually has a pretty robust, pretty fully fledged free option. And then beyond that, you can get into like the next tier, which is still fairly cost effective. It does get expensive the more you bolt on, but it's a very useful tool from an attribution standpoint, from a sales pipeline management standpoint. Dashboarding is like available in a tier above, but it's also not overly expensive to get access to some pretty good dashboarding. So I think HubSpot's a great tool. Outside of that, I know this is a little bit different. Maybe it's a slight step away, but I'm a huge advocate for Slack. I think Slack is an incredible tool for a marketing organization. It's a great tool for gaining alignment across functions. I've actually worked in quite a lot of marketing setups where we worked in sprints, which isn't necessarily what you'd expect to hear when talking about marketing, but it's worked exceptionally well for us. And the thing that has facilitated that is Slack. So Slack's a phenomenal tool for alignment, for sharing. It's also a great way to democratize information because you have all of that on record. So if someone new joins your team, they join a Slack channel, they have the history. So you don't lose sight of the past conversations, the past learnings, and that kind of thing. So I think Slack's great. And then finally, Liz will tell you this. This is also a little bit of a like sidebar, but I love Loom. I absolutely love Loom. If you haven't used Loom before, Loom is a phenomenal tool to fast track this kind of thing. It allows you to do video recordings and screen sharing and then disseminate that across your team. It's a fantastic way to really rapidly grow, accelerate, and to test things and to gain alignment whilst doing that.
Yes, Tim is a huge fan of Loom. He's introduced me to it. I love it too. So we have one last question that has been snuck in by Hisham. Hello, Hisham.
Oh, Hisham.
Nice to have
my
you.
word. Nice surprise.
And he's asked a very technical question, which I love. And what I do love is that this conversation has been absolutely punctuated by lots and lots of much more science backing. It makes me really excited. I'm a massive science-based and data-driven marketer. So the more of us that are in marketing, that we continue to really grow this swell and this narrative around performance-backed marketing, marketing that is not fluffy, that is actually more results-driven and performance-driven, and ultimately drives the business forward. I always say that within an organization, marketing leads the business. Marketing is the only, another great analogy that was raised by a wonderful and very well-respected marketer at the IMC was that marketing is the only function within an organization that looks forward. And if you're thinking about growth and if you're thinking about scaling and what the future of the business holds, that is all happening within marketing. I love that analogy so much. So let's quickly answer Hisham's question and then we'll jump right into the draw. So, Tim, Hisham's very compelling question for you is as follows. When looking at optimizing digital campaigns, what are the key things to look for to identify where one actually needs to optimize or enhance a campaign at the various stages of the marketing funnel?
Very good question. Very good question. So the way I would look at this, and this is assuming that you have a decent enough view of your funnel. I'd look at the funnel and look at where drop-off is occurring. So and that's going to be pretty normal and pretty predictable in many respects. You're going to have drop-off from, say, lead to the next step in your conversion funnel, and then beyond that, the next step of your conversion funnel. But are you seeing sort of a marked drop-off at any point? How does that how does that relate to historical data? So if you have historical data, if you have historical performance data, how does that relate? Has that shifted? Has that changed? If not, if you don't have historical data, how does that align to your expectations? So is there more pronounced drop-off at any point than you might expect? Does it surprise you? and then start to dig into each of those. And what you'll find is that they have various contributing factors or mediums. So if you're looking at, your lead generation, and you're driving visitors to your site, but there's a low conversion rate to inquiry. I'll just use inquiry for this example. What channels are driving that interest, and how are they performing in relation to each other? Is there one channel that's performing markedly worse than the others, for example? If yes, then you start to diagnose why that is. And once again, if you've got historical data, then you can go and reference that, and you can determine whether that used to be the case, if that's been consistent, or if something's actually changed. So then you'd start to do a deeper diagnosis, and you'd move through and you'd look at, say, once someone's created a profile or they've made an inquiry, they've become a lead, is there a more pronounced drop-off there than you might anticipate? What communications are they receiving? Are they getting emails? If so, what emails are those? Are those emails performing as you'd expect in terms of things like open rate and click rate? Are you getting a higher unsubscribe rate than you'd anticipate? Is there supposed to be a sales call going on? Has that actually happened? Has someone phoned them? If so, how long did they take to phone them? Did they take too long? Did they take like 2 or 3 days? What's your usual response time? Do you normally WhatsApp someone? Has that happened? So on and so forth. And you move through that process and you diagnose where you believe problem areas exist, either because you have data to say that, or you are very new, but you just expect it should work better than that, or you clearly identify, okay, we're doing really well here. Like we in our scenario planning, and I can talk about this forever, but like in our scenario planning, we've plotted out that we need to achieve a cost per lead, for example, of 100 Rand. We're coming in at 80 Rand. Fantastic. We don't need to look at that right now. But in our scenario planning, we also anticipated that people would move from lead to the next stage at, say, a 30% rate. They're currently only moving at a 20% rate. All right, what's going on? Like, let's dig into that. And you use that as your reference, and to pinpoint where you should dive in, and then you dive in and you start to do that deeper diagnosis.
Amazing. Tim, that was very, very comprehensive. Just looking at the volume of questions we received, I think this has been one of our webinars where we've had the most number of questions now, so definitely burning questions. If you want all your burning questions answered again and you want to win a free 1 hour with Tim, we're now going to do the draw. You have to be on the webinar still, so thank you for those that have stayed on. We're going to go ahead and do the draw. I'm going to ask Max and Kat from my team to quickly switch over and quickly do the draw. And then we will announce the winner right now.
Cool. Should I stop sharing so they can do that?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, Tim.
Cool. Thank you.
Alrighty, so in true data style, we have a very official looking draw. I'm going to let my team run through the delegates that are still on the call, and we will select one lucky winner. You have one in. Let's just check the data. You've got 177 chances of being the one to win the 1 hour session, and you can have 1 in 78 chances of being the lucky winner to win the 1 hour. Congratulations. Courtney White, congratulations, you are the winner of 1 hour with Tim. Let's check that Courtney is still on the call. I'm going to do the official verification. I don't think she's on the call, guys. Do we want to do another draw? Oh dear.
We get to hear the sound again and see the animations. That's cool.
Okay, go ahead. Megan Hall. Let's see. Megan. Yay, Megan's on the call. Yay. Congratulations, Megan.
Awesome. Congratulations, Megan.
Yay, well done, Megan.
So
Good
exciting.
job,
Thank
Megan.
you.
You get all your questions answered in 1 hour with Tim, and we will send you the details. Everybody that is stayed on the call, thank you so much again for joining us and spending your lunchtime with us. We look forward to hosting you all again. We will be sharing a wrap-up that will include the recording, and we look forward to hosting you guys again. Big thank you again to Tim. Tim, you were amazing. Lots of wonderful questions. Thanks, everybody, for participating.
Thank you all. It's been awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.